In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the engine oil pan on this Ford F-150 with the 5.4 liter V8. Let's get started. Now underneath the truck, you'll see the oil pan right here. It has a 16mm drain plug. So let's grab a wrench or a socket and remove it and let the oil drain. Make sure you put the oil in a collection bucket so you can recycle it properly. Put your tool on there, break it free. It shouldn't be very tight. If it is, that means it's likely over-tightened. Once you can get it by hand, keep upwards pressure on it. And as soon as you feel it get to the last thread, pull it out quickly. This will avoid as much of a mess as possible. And let's let it drain until it's completely done. It's down to a pretty slow and steady drip, so I'm going to cap it off. If you want to wait longer, go ahead. But I'm going to call this done. Thread the drain plug in. We're going to snug it up and then torque it. Clean up the area. I like to do this right before the drain bolt is about to completely bottom out so that any oil that's underneath the washer can get out. Of course, I'm going to do this again after. Just wipe it. That's snug. I'm going to leave it there. To continue, let's remove this cross member here. We need access to drop the oil pan down. So there are two 15mm bolts with two 18mm nuts on each side. Let's remove all four of them. I'm going to leave the bolts in so that the whole cross member can stay supported even when I'm done unbolting it. I'm going to use a rubber mallet to tap these out. Looks like this one's pretty seized in here. Okay, to unseize this one, I'm going to try to spin it with the wrench. There we go. There we go. Grab a pry bar and pry this down. If you can't pry it, grab a hammer and try to tap it out. There we go. Now, because we have a four-wheel drive vehicle, we have to lower the front differential. If you don't, just skip the step. It's going to be a whole lot easier for you. The first bolt I'm going to go for is that 21mm bolt that's right next to the drive shaft. It goes through the frame, and I'm going to completely remove it at this point. Before taking any bolts out, I just wanted to mention that I did put a pull jack here for support. If you're on the ground, you can use your floor jack or some jack stands, whatever you have. It's not going to just fall out. It's still connected everywhere, but you want to be in control of the lowering process of this. You don't want it to just fall down. Here's a view of it from the bottom. At this point, with the pull jack adjusted to just the right height, I can pull this bolt out. I'm going to use a stubby wrench on the back side to push it out as I unthread it. There we go. The next bolt is going to be in the vicinity of the one that we just removed, but it's going to be a lot harder to get to. So what I mean is it's that 18mm bolt right there above the whole differential. Actually, if you have a long enough extension, you can go right here above the oil filter drain and end up right at that bolt over there. If you cannot get in there with a socket, or you think the bolt won't clear the steering column, just turn the steering wheel one way or the other until the pinch bolt for the shaft moves out of the way. Okay, here we go. And on the passenger side, there's going to be a bolt just like the one we had to remove just a second ago. Also an 18mm. This one you can reach a lot easier with a socket and extension above the frame, just like we did earlier. Pull this out. captive nut from the other side fell down. That's normal. Adjust your support accordingly to release pressure off of this bolt. Now lower the front differential slowly. Okay, I guess at this point it's not going to come down anymore, so I'm going to remove my support. And now we have to remove this plastic retainer here that holds the wires for the starter. And if you look closely, right where the wires come out of that bracket, there's a little bolt right up there. We have to remove it. It's a 10 millimeter. So grab a ratchet or a wrench, whatever you can fit in here, and we'll just take that out. And with that removed, you should be able to pull this away. Perfect. This will give us access to the oil pan bolts underneath. In order to free up these transmission cooler lines, we also have to unbolt this bracket. It sits right next to the passenger side catalytic converter. Use a 13 millimeter and get that bolt off. Pull that out. This is actually one of the bolts that holds the starter as well. Now we have a little bit more play in these lines. On the transmission side, they are going straight into the transmission. The steel lines are aluminum. But on the other side, they have a hose attached to them, so they do move around quite a bit, which is what we need. To continue removing the plastic bracket, if you look from the front of the engine where the cross member goes, you'll see a 15 millimeter mounting nut that goes over a stud. Let's remove this nut, and this will release both that bracket, the plastic one, as well as the lines that we just unbolted off the other side. Here's a better view at the stud with the mounting nut on it. That way you can see as I take it off. Set this aside, and now if you push the lines in that bracket forward, you should be able to slide this off. Do the bracket first, the plastic one. Okay, it looks like I don't have enough slack, so let's create more slack. And the reason for that is because as I pull on the bracket, these grounding wires here are being stretched out all the way. So all we have to do is just unbolt that 13 millimeter nut, and then we should have quite a bit more room in the harness. Take that off. You can pull the wires away. You don't have to disconnect the rest of them. The rest of them should have plenty of slack for the bracket to come off of there. There we go. That's what I want. Now you can push this aside. Now these lines you don't have to remove, but at least we can manipulate them out of our way. At the front of the oil pan, you'll notice 4 13 millimeter bolts, and the best way to get to them is going to be with a swivel socket and a long extension. I'm not going to be able to take them all the way out with the air gun because the steering rack is in the way. But if I can break them free like this, I can just take them out by hand the rest of the way. They do spin fairly freely at this point. So those are out. Now we can work on the rest of them. I'm going to go on the passenger side of the engine right here, take out those just because they're a little more difficult. I want to take the difficult ones out first. Difficult to see, but right next to where we just worked, there's going to be another 13 millimeter bolt where the transmission lines and that bracket go. So you're going to have to sneak your socket in here and try to get it on that bolt and just remove it all the way. That's unthreaded enough to where I can probably pull it out by hand now. Okay, I know you can't see it well, but there is one right there behind the bracket. I'm going to try and move that bracket out of the way so you can see. The more difficult part here is going to be the transmission lines. Those are going to be in your way and not as easy to move as the plastic bracket. Okay. Okay, at this point, the rest of them should be a lot easier to get to. There are 3 in a row right here, continuing from where we just left off. Between the transmission and the oil pan right here, you'll see 2 more bolts. After I take these 3 out, I'm actually going to support the oil pan. That way it doesn't drop down in case it does break free. So let's put a pole jack underneath it. If you're working on the ground, gently support it with a jack or something to hold it up here actually. I'm going to use a wooden block to hold pressure on here. All right, last 2 bolts. That's it. Oil pan is unbolted. Let's drop it down. Okay, I'm going to remove my support. As you can see, the oil pan is ready to come down, so just be careful. There is still oil in the oil pan, so hold it up as straight as possible. It seems to be getting caught on these transmission lines as I try to wiggle it down, so I'm going to very, very gently try to pry them away. I'm just trying to basically get it to clear these ears for the bolts on the oil pan. And it's almost there, but just barely doesn't make it over. Oh, easy there. Okay, there we go. Turn it, aim it towards the passenger side. There we go. And there's the oil pan. I had to pull down on the front differential just a little bit. It needed a couple more millimeters of clearance. Don't tip it over because there is still oil in it, so drain it in your collection bucket. Now you can pull off the oil pan gasket and we can clean the surface. It's RTV'd on each corner, that's normal. So it might be somewhat stuck on here. Just pry it off, and once you get this out of here, before we install or do anything else, we'll have to clean this surface up and get it ready for the new gasket. If you don't clean it well and always replace the gasket, well, it's going to leak and you have to do the job all over again. The oil pan gasket also comes with an O-ring for the pickup tube, so let's replace that as well while we're at it. There's a 10mm bolt that holds the pickup tube on the back side of the engine. And if you follow the tube on the front part of the engine, there are 2 more. These are 8mm bolts. Remove both of these. Pull the pickup tube down. Remove the old O-ring. Put the new one on. And line it back up with the engine. And put the 2 bolts back in. Start them by hand. And bottom them out. I'm going to torque these 2, then we'll move to the front one and torque that one as well. It's important that these are properly tightened. You don't want this coming loose on you, otherwise you'll lose oil pressure, and if you over tighten them, you can strip out the threads, it won't stay tight, and then it'll come off and, well, you'll lose oil pressure. The torque for these 2 is 89 inch-pounds, which converts to 7.4 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench that goes that low, just make sure they're nice and snug by hand. Give them about 1/8, at most 1/4 of a turn after they bottom out. That's it right there. And second one, perfect. Double check them, and now let's torque the other one. Now put this bolt in, ensure that it's lined up and it's clamped down properly here on the oil pickup tube. The torque for this one is 18 foot-pounds. Let's clean up the RTV here. Like I said, there is a little bit on each corner. I'm first going to wipe off the excess oil that dripped down, and then I like to use a razor blade. You can use a gasket scraper, whatever else you have, that's going to get this off of here without damaging the surface. That's the goal. This is a cast iron block, and it is pretty difficult to damage compared to an aluminum material, But keep in mind, you don't want to sand this down, you don't want to gouge this surface. You want it to stay nice and flat so the new gasket can seal up. There we go. Scrape all of this away. We're going to have to apply a new layer of RTV, but I'm going to show you that when the time comes. You want to make sure everything is nice and clean. If there's any inside the engine, like here, make sure you get that out of there. And you want to just go around, scrape the rest of the surface if needed. Make sure it's nice and clean. Now I'm going to use brake parts cleaner on a clean rag and just degrease the surface. It doesn't have to look brand new, but it does have to be free of any oil and debris so that the gasket can seal up. Just go around and do the whole oil pan. If you see any more leftover gasket maker, scrape that off. Make sure the surface is flat, and then I'll show you exactly how much to apply. Now with the surface cleaned and ready to accept the new gasket, get a little bit of high torque RTV. I recommend the high torque one because this oil pan is going to go on pretty tight. If you can't get that, at least get the oil resistant RTV. Put a little bit on. This might be a little too much, but definitely don't go more than that. You just want to coat the surface where the block meets the back cover here. As you can see, there's a split. You're going to want to do the same to the other corner on the rear of the engine. Just a little bit of RTV on here. This is going to ensure that that split seals up and doesn't leak oil externally. You'll find the same exact situation on the front of the engine where the timing cover meets the block. This one's going to be a little more challenging to get to. Apply a little bit of RTV on here as well. If you can't get to it because of the lines, just take your finger with a glove on it and spread it out evenly, and of course do the same on the other corner. Now take your new gasket and lay it on the oil pan. It can only go in one way, so I'll keep that in mind. And now slide the pan up in place with the gasket. Try not to disturb the RTV that you just placed. All right, bring the oil pan up, get a couple bolts ready, put in whatever bolt lines up first for you. I got one in. Try to bottom it out by hand, that way it holds the oil pan in place. We'll put one on the other side. There we go. Okay, so I got two bottomed out by hand, not tight, not snug, just bottomed out, holding this oil pan on. Now this gives me a little bit more flexibility in starting the rest of them. Doesn't matter what sequence you start them in, just go around, start them all. One tip that I forgot to mention is make sure that your bolts are clean. You don't want any oil or debris on them. Use brake parts cleaner if you have to. Make sure they're not rotted. If they are, replace them. If they're covered in oil, clean them off so that you can have nice clean threads going in there and clamping on correctly. Now with all of them started, let's torque them down. The torque for this goes in 3 different passes in a particular sequence. The sequence being starting from the center, working your way in a crisscross pattern towards the outer bolts. The torque specs are first 18 inch-pounds, which is very little. It's basically just bottomed out. Then 14.7 foot-pounds, that's 177 inch-pounds. After you've gone to the 14.7 foot-pounds, you want to go around in the same exact sequence, crisscross from the middle, out, and you want to torque these another 60 degrees. And because we have degrees involved, I'm going to repeat the second step twice. That way, I make sure that they're all properly tightened to 14.7. because after that, we're dealing with a rotational torque, not the force of the clamping force read by the torque wrench. It's basically a particular amount of rotation of the bolt. So if you don't start off with a proper baseline torque, your rotational torque is going to be off. So basically what I'm saying is bottom them out in that sequence, torque them to 14.7 foot-pounds, double check them all, and then an additional 60 degrees on all of them. Now let's torque them to 14.7 foot-pounds. And like I said, I'm going to go around twice. I am using the swivel socket on some of them, so I have to keep that in mind. It's going to alter the torque, but it is what it is. I cannot get around these lines with any other type of socket. I'm going to double check them all. This time I'm just going to go around in a circle. Once I verify that they are all at 14.7 foot-pounds, we're going to go another 60 degrees on each. Well, they're all tight to 14.7 foot-pounds, so here we go, additional 60 degrees each. Now 60 degrees is 1/6 of a turn, so if 90 is a quarter and 45 is an eighth, well, as you can imagine, 1/6 is 60 degrees, right in the middle. So if you don't have a torque wrench that can read degrees, or an angle reader, sometimes they make an adapter that goes on a breaker bar, ratchet, whatever you have, and reads the amount of angle that you're putting into the turn. If you don't have any of that, just eyeball it. As long as you turn it between a quarter and an eighth of a turn, you should be good to go. I happen to have a torque wrench that is digital and does read degrees, so that's what I'm going to use. Keep in mind, the same sequence applies here. Start from the center, work your way out, and go in a crisscross pattern. Oh, all right, that was my socket slipping. Now they're all torqued, and just as a reference for you, I looked at the torque wrench. It does tell me the torque after I'm done twisting it with the 60-degree pass, and I got numbers anywhere between 30 and 36 foot-pounds. So if you don't have a digital torque wrench or a way to read degrees, that is another estimation that you can do. The only problem is you are going to have to use a swivel socket for a lot of these, and that is likely why they gave you a torque in degrees and not in foot-pounds, because it's not going to be accurate if you use a swivel socket on a torque wrench and you go like this and the torque is measured here, and then there's a lost reading as soon as the swivel bends. So keep that in mind. But just as a reference for you, the final torque shouldn't be anywhere over 35, 36 foot-pounds in the end, if you do happen to have a torque wrench that can read it. Now with the oil pan installed, let's make sure the drain plug is fully tightened and torqued to spec. The torque for the drain plug is 17 foot-pounds. If you're not able to torque it, don't worry about it. Just give it at most a quarter of a turn after it bottoms out. Now let's get the bracket reconnected here. I did not take my lines off of this stud, so all I have to put back is the bracket. If you somehow manage to pop the lines off and you need to put them back on, I'll go ahead and put that bracket on. There we go. Make sure it gets fully seated here. Now we can put the nut back. This one was a 15mm mounting nut. Start it on, and let's just bottom it out. Make sure it's nice and snug. The torque for this is 89 inch-pounds, that's 7.4 foot-pounds. But because of the swivel socket situation, I'm not going to torque it. It's not going to give me an accurate torque, so I'm just going to make it nice and snug with my ratchet. 7.4 foot-pounds is not a lot. There we go. It's only holding on that plastic bracket and the metal bracket for the lines, so it really doesn't have to be crazy tight. Let's resecure the bracket on the back side towards the rear of the engine. This one had the 10mm bolt going through. Get that started by hand, and let's snug it up. Yep, that's nice and tight right there. Let's reconnect the ground wires at the bottom of the starter now. Make sure that there is minimal corrosion here. You don't want this to be rotted or severely corroded, and mine is not. Put the mounting nut back on. This was the 13mm nut. And with it on, let's bottom it out. Now it's bottomed out, let's snug it up. Okay, doesn't have to be very tight. Make sure that it's properly clamped on there. Get your socket off. Now get the bracket for the rear part of the lines lined up with the transmission bell housing. Stick this longer bolt through, thread it on, make sure it actually engages. There we go. I guess this is going smoothly, so I'm just going to bottom it out as far as I can by hand. Then we're going to come back and tighten it and torque it. This one is also holding the starter on, so it's important that it's properly secured on here. The torque for this is 35 foot-pounds. That's it right there. Now it's time to put the front differential back up. This, of course, is if you have one for the four-wheel drive model. I'm using a pull jack, piece of wood, so I don't damage the housing. And I'm just going to slowly bring it up into place. I'm going to watch for the bolt holes. Oh, there we go. I'm going to make sure it all lines up as it should. And it looks like it's all going exactly where it needs to go. And after I bring it up enough for at least the first bolt to line up, whatever lines up first, I'm going to stick the bolt through. It looks like this one over here lines up, so let's put that one in. I'm not going to tighten any of them until they're all in, because all three of these will determine exactly where the differential is going to sit. I want to make sure it's perfectly centered and positioned. The bolt on the passenger side was the one that had the nut with the tab welded on it. Looks like I went a little too far up. Adjust your support as necessary to get this in all the way. To get the nut on, just place it over the bolt and then spin the bolt with your ratchet. I just want to get it started. Once again, I'm not tightening anything up. I'm just going to make sure that all of the bolts are in position. Okay, so this is about where I'm going to leave this one. Let's put the other two in. Next, I'm going to aim for the one that is right above the differential. That was the other 18mm bolt with the pointed end to it. And this one is a little more difficult to get to. I'm going to put the bolt into my extension and use that to guide the bolt all the way through, well, with the socket, of course. And once I get it close in there, I can hopefully just tap it into place. There we go. Now I'm going to try to get this started. I want to make sure that the threads engage. There we go. That one's going in now. I'm gonna leave it there. Let's put the last one in and then tighten all of them up. Now for this last one, I'm gonna pry up on this differential while the pole jack is supporting it. You can also put a second support towards the front where the drive shaft bolts on. Basically, it has to tilt upwards, as you can see, so that the bolt hole can line up. There we go. The torque for these is 85 foot-pounds. That applies to all three of the mounting bolts. Let's finish tightening this one up and then torque it. All right. There we go. That's 85 on this one as well. Last thing to do under here is to put this support brace back in. It's not directional, but if you did want to put it the same exact way as it came out, go ahead. I'm gonna line it up approximately with the bolt holes, tap it into place. I'm gonna use the help of my pole jack to press it up in. If you just want to use a rubber mallet, go ahead. The only thing I recommend is to avoid using a steel hammer so that you don't bend it. Now that it's in position, I'm going to remove this so I can shift it around as necessary. Let's try to line up the bolts. I'm going to put in whatever lines up first, preferably one on each side. Okay, so that one goes all the way through. That's perfect. Looks like this one needs to go up a little bit. And the other two. Put the mounting nuts on. Okay, let's snug them up, and then I'll come back and torque them. 18mm socket and 15mm wrench to hold the bolt. The torque for all four of these is 66 foot-pounds. I'm going to torque the nut side because that avoids the friction of the bolt going through the sleeve, so you get a more accurate torque spec. If necessary, hold the bolt. That's installed. Because we're basically doing an oil change at this point, I'm also going to remove and replace the oil filter. Highly recommended. Now looking through the front, underneath the front bumper, you'll see the oil filter. It also has a little spout that it will drain on, so keep that in mind. It's nice because it's not going to get all over the frame. Just make sure you aim the collection bucket properly to catch the fluid. If you can't get it by hand, you're going to need an oil filter wrench. They make different styles. This is the strap style where it goes around, and then as you pull down on it, it grabs onto the filter. Although you are very limited on space here, so keep that in mind. I have my collection bucket ready to catch any fluid that might come out. Remove the filter. Pull this out. Inspect the oil filter housing where the filter goes on. Make sure there's no rubber gasket stuck on here. If it is, take it off because the filter should come with it, not the housing. So now just wipe off any excess oil that remains here. You want to have a nice clean surface for the new filter to seal on. If some starts dripping again, that's fine. But for now, I wanted to inspect it, make sure the threads are good here. Everything is clean, so we're ready to get the new filter on. Take a little bit of oil and put it on the O-ring here, on the gasket. I'm not going to fill the filter because it does sit sideways and most of it will spill out, even though usually I do like to pre-fill them. In this case, it's not going to work. Grab the new oil filter, put it in position here, push the lower radiator hose out of your way if you need to. Make sure that doesn't cross thread. It should thread on smoothly like this. And once it bottoms out, it even says it on the filter itself, go about 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn. If you do it with a wrench, you will most likely over tighten it. There we go, just make it nice and snug by hand. Clean off any remaining oil that has dripped off. Now let's fill the engine up with oil. On the passenger side front, right between your battery and the air intake, you'll see the oil filler cap. On it, it says exactly what type of oil to use or what weight, what viscosity. It's 5W20. Take the oil filler cap off, set it aside, and then put in 7 quarts of 5W20. With all 7 quarts in, put the oil filler cap back, make sure it's locked in, and let's check the oil level. On the driver's side, you'll see the yellow dipstick. That's the oil dipstick. Take it out. I like to wipe it off as it comes out. And just so you have a reference as to what we're looking for, the dot at the top is the full mark, the one at the bottom is the low mark. You want to be anywhere in between the two, but right on the top is actually preferred. So let's dip it back into the dipstick tube and see where we're at. Bring it all the way down, and then take it back out without wiping it this time because we want to take a reading of what it measured. It's hard to see on camera, but we are right above the full mark actually, right about here, and that's perfect. That's where we want to be. The engine hasn't started. The oil filter is not full yet, so once we start it, it should drop right about here. So this is actually perfect. Let's put this back, stick it all the way in, and there we go. To complete the oil change, let's reset the maintenance reminder or oil change reminder. Turn the ignition to the on position. You don't have to turn the truck on for this. On this center screen, you'll see a bunch of different pop-ups pop up, including this oil change required. So to reset that, you go over here where you have your buttons, but this layout will be different depending on what trim you have or if you even have the navigation package or not. Click the setup button, and as you click it, you can switch through different things in the menu here, and the second thing should actually be oil life. So right now we're at 0%. It's timed, so you have to be pretty quick when doing this, but at this point you have to hold the reset button, and I have to go back into it because it timed out. Hold the reset button, and after a couple seconds, there we go, it's reset to 100%. So that's how we know that the oil change reminder has been reset.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.